Hey, welcome in you Gooshbagz. Welcome into week 6 of the Gooshbagz League podcast. It's been a big week, mainly because, well, number one, the Scary Terrys won, but number two, we finally set the keeper rules as of today. More like I set the keeper rules. We've been going over it the last week or so and talking about whether or not it was fair to start the keepers in the middle of the season, and the person that would have been affected the most by it was Adam, and I don't feel so bad because he encouraged me to continue doing keepers, to go forward with the keepers, even though we hadn't had set rules yet. Um, to be honest, I didn't know that it would affect the league in the middle of this year's league. I suppose I should have thought it through a little bit more, but to be honest, I think it'll only have a minimal impact. He's Adam is in the worst condition, I think, as far as where as far as his record currently, not a great record, and also he's got 2 first round draft picks that he'll have to figure out, either trade out for a couple of lesser tier guys, that will help out, that'll fill out his roster and maybe duke it out to a spot in the playoffs, or um, or at least get some keepers that he can keep 2 of, I suppose. Um, I don't think it'll be that big of a problem. And I know we were trying to do a lot of polls. I was trying to get everybody's opinion, and I got some people voting, some people not. And then we were on the topic of whether or not we should even do keepers, and then I just kind of made the decision. So we're gonna do 2 keepers. We're gonna do no neither of the keepers can be the same position. So you have to have a running back and a wide receiver, or a running back and a quarterback, or a quarterback and a tight end. But you can't have 2 of the same. And there will be a draft penalty for the keeper. So the penalty will be the average between the draft position of this year's draft and the average draft position next year, at the time that we draft. So this will work for waivers too. So if you get somebody on waivers in the middle of the year, like I said, like a Nick Chubb like player from last year, that way, you know their average draft position might be in the first or second round, so you'd end up getting that keeper at a value still in the 7th or 8th round. So I think that works out well. You'll still have your first and second round picks, and you'll get value in that 7th or 8th round, with your basically first round value. So I think this will do just fine, and I don't think that really think the only person that was truly affected by this rule was Adam. I don't think anybody else made significant enough trades to destroy their keeper value for next year. So I know not everybody was on board with it, but I feel like I had the majority, and there were only a couple of you guys. I think Neil and Benaya were the main ones kind of holding out for keepers. So don't hate me, guys, but I just wanted to get this stuff, get these rules rolling, and get the keeper league underway, because I know we're all excited to kind of do a keeper league this year. So, uh, all right, enough with the news in our league. Let's go to the news in the NFL. So, in terms of injuries this week, unfortunately, we'll start with my big injury, Will Disley, who has been a fantastic tight end for me so far. Unfortunately, tore his Achilles this week, and he's most likely out for a season. So I'm gonna have to figure out something else to do in the tight end position this week, or I guess for the rest of the year. I'll have to figure it out this week. So it's really sad for Will Disley. He's been having a fantastic. He had a previous injury last year where he started off well as well. I think he played 1 or 2 games and got touchdowns in all of his games. And this year he had a touchdown in almost every game he played, and he was looking fantastic. While he wasn't having the high ceiling games that like Austin Hooper and Travis Kelsey and whatnot were having, but um, he was a consistent like high single digits and teens for almost every week, and that was great. But I guess we're gonna have to move on. Hopefully, he recovers well from that. He's a young guy, so hopefully he can recover and continue onward with his fantastic career. Amari Cooper got knocked out of the game early with a quad injury. Usually, I think they have a quick turnaround this week. They might be playing on Thursday night. I'm not sure, but usually it sounded like it was a quad contusion as well, which is what Todd Gurley had. Usually that's not a massive injury, but he might be potentially be out for a week. So we'll see what his injury status looks like going forward, or later in this week, and it'll determine whether or not he's playing this weekend. But Chris Thompson had a foot injury this week, and Adrian Peterson had a big day in his absence. So Adrian Peterson looked good out there versus Miami. The new offensive coordinator said he was going to run the ball a lot more, and that's what they did. So if they continue that in the next few weeks, Adrian Peterson might be an asset. Emmanuel Sanders got a knee injury, and he did not finish the game. I'm not sure the extent of this injury, but he has had a rough last couple weeks. Cortland Sutton's kind of taken over that offense, taken over the one spot in that offense. So um, Emmanuel Sanders, hopefully he can get back to it. And then Baker Mayfield left and then came back with a hip injury, and he started off hot this week. I kind of gave Brandon a little bit of shit this week because I was like, hey, why'd you drop Baker? Even though I gave him shit for the last like 3 weeks to tell him to drop Baker, but I don't think he ended up with a great game. But also Brandon started Jameis Winston this week, so who had 5 interceptions. Um, Speaking of Brandon's team, Will Fuller came back down to earth after the $55 ad from last week. He's always been that boomer bust guy, so I'm not really surprised he didn't have a huge game, especially with Houston's offense has so many weapons in it, so he's kind of gonna have boomer bust weeks based on the matchup. That's just how Will Fuller is going forward, similar to Stephon Diggs, who had a fantastic week this week. Sam Darnold came back from big spleen syndrome, aka mononucleosis, or whatever that the rest of that word is. He had a big win over Dallas. Dallas has looked rough the last couple weeks. They've dropped 2 in a row, I think, to not great teams. But I think the Jets' offense really, and I said this at the beginning of the year. I said it before Sam Darnold went out. I think the Jets' offense actually could be decent this year. They could have some pieces in their offense that are fantasy relevant, and overall, that offense has improved since last year. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Jets maybe upset a couple more teams going forward. I don't know what their schedule exactly looks. I think the next couple weeks are tough. I think they got New England this weekend. Um, but then after that, I think their schedule is looking really good. So um, I wouldn't be surprised if Sam Darnold and the Jets kind of helped out a lot of fantasy owners on their way to the playoffs. Speaking of the playoffs and a potentially playoff bound team, the top scorer in the league was Brandon Cooks Kittlecorn for the third time this year already. He had 149.3 points, giving Big Ben's Bathroom his first loss this year. So everybody has had at least one loss in this Gooshbagz Fantasy Football League, and fortunately, everyone has at least one win now, as Rogers Cup took down. They took down Benaya's team, right? They took down Zerline. I never hit you. So, um, so good for him. Now everybody's got a win in the league. Nobody is winless. it's a fight between the running Mayfields and Rogers Cup for that title. So moving on to the studs of the week. At the quarterback position, Matt Ryan had 30.9 fantasy points. He went 30 for 36 with 356 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 2 rushes for 7 yards. He had a very high scoring game versus Arizona. Unfortunately for the Falcons, he couldn't come out with the win, but he put up some big fantasy numbers in the meantime. Their defense just kind of sucks, so he's going to be putting up numbers like this all year. Um, and I thought that their defense was going to be better this year because last year their defense only sucked because they had so many injuries. But it looks like it's going to be a similar, some sort of similar storyline this year. So Matt Ryan's going to be putting up big games all year, I think. Lamar Jackson had another big week this week. He had 30.6 fantasy points. He went 21 for 33 for 236 passing yards. He had no passing touchdowns, but listen to this. Get this. He rushed the ball 19 times for 152 yards and 1 touchdown. You would be happy for those numbers from any running back. 150 yards and 1 touchdown, but he's a quarterback, so he had 230 passing yards on top of that. With all that rushing work, he's definitely a solid quarterback as you can possibly have. And we kind of knew that not going into the year, but after the first couple of weeks, he knew he had a quality quarterback in Lamar Jackson. So I traded him away. Deshaun Watson was the number 3 quarterback this week. He had 29.4 fantasy points. He put up 30 for 42 for 280 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. He also had 10 rushes for 42 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. He got most of those fantasy points on the ground this week. With those 2 rushing touchdowns, those are big for a quarterback. So, yeah, I mean nothing new at the top. No surprising Case Keenums or Teddy Bridgewaters this week. So the top 3 that you kind of expected, except maybe Pat Mahomes is off that list, but otherwise the top 3 that you kind of expected are the ones that are up there. And the running back category, speaking of unexpected victories, James Conner, number 1 fantasy running back this week with 27.4 fantasy points. He had 16 rushes for 41 yards, so he wasn't super efficient on the ground, but he was also running against like 8-man stacks the whole game because they had Devlin Hodges at the helm. But he did have 1 rushing touchdown. He also had 7 catches for 78 yards and a touchdown. It was a huge comeback game for James Conner, and I just want to say my bold take that he would have a bigger game than Christian McCaffrey was correct. So suck it, Christian McCaffrey. You didn't make the top 3 this week. So that's a down week for you. You must be disappointed, Courts. I know you are. Number 2 running back on the week this week was Nick Chubb. He had 26.4 fantasy points. He had 20 rushes for 122 yards, 2 touchdowns, and he also had 5 catches for 17 yards. Nick Chubb, the last few weeks, has finally been the running back that you wanted them to be. I guess he was drafted in the 3rd round this year. I don't know what sort of role Kareem Hunt will have when he comes back, but Nick Chubb has definitely earned his starting role in Cleveland. So I currently have Kareem Hunt. I picked him up last week because somebody dropped them. To be honest, I really don't know if he's going to be even a startable fantasy asset once he comes back. He will be a handcuff, very important handcuff when he comes back, but I don't think he's going to get as much work as people think he will when he gets back. And the number 3 running back on the week was Devontae Freeman, also a comeback game. People have been waiting for him to do well all year. He had 25.3 fantasy points. He had 19 rushes for 88 yards and 3 catches for 30 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Well, he finally has his big game. He's been stepping up his game recently, and hopefully he stays involved in the passing game because that's where he's going to need to do his work, especially with Atlanta falling behind in probably every game they're going to play. Now onto the running back or the wide receiver category. Stephon Diggs had 40 fantasy points this week. Huge game by Stephon Diggs. Everyone was clamoring for him to do well. He had 7 catches for 167 yards and 3 touchdowns. It's really only his second game over 10 fantasy points, so he's had a rough go of it at the beginning of the year. To be honest, his most similar comp, and I guess I made it earlier this podcast, but a similar comp is Will Fuller. He's just kind of a boomer bust player. Thielen is definitely the most consistent wide receiver in that offense, but Stephon Diggs is guaranteed to have his big games. All right, the wide receiver number 2 on the week was Scary Terry McLaurin, or the F1. He had 24 fantasy points. He had 4 catches for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's looking amazing this year. He's been a beast so far, so it'll be really tough to bench him from now on. And the wide receiver number 3 was Tyreek Hill on his big game back from his collarbone injury. He is a monster, and he's definitely going to help out Rodgers Cup for the rest of the year. He had 22.5 fantasy points. He had 5 catches for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. That just goes to show that no matter who else is on the field, everybody's had big games from Pat Mahomes. A lot of wide receivers have been kind of filling in for Tyreek Hill, but as soon as Tyreek Hill's back, he's the man on top. So, and then the honorable mention, I'm going to say a fourth because, Robbie Anderson on the day that Sam Darnold gets back, he had a big game. He had a lot of his points on a 92-yard touchdown catch from Sam Darnold, and unfortunately his schedule doesn't look too good over the next few weeks, so it'll be tough to start him over the next couple weeks, but in a few weeks I think his schedule looks a little bit better, so he should do decent in a few weeks. I think he'll be definitely potentially worth a start. So, and the tight end position, Hunter Henry, another big game off of an injury. This is really interesting because a lot of times people that come back from an injury are kind of slow to start. They have a kind of a mediocre game on their first game back, and then the second game is kind of when they blow up. But in this case, with Tyreek Hill had a huge game, and Hunter Henry also had a big game. He had 26 fantasy points. He had 8 catches for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. So it was good to see Hunter Henry come back and kind of do what everybody was hoping he would do. Everyone's been clamoring for a Hunter Henry breakout, and I guess he's had a decent season, but he's also been kind of injury prone. So hopefully he stays healthy and he continues his dominance in the league. Austin Hooper, once again in the top 3. He had 21.7 fantasy points. He had 8 catches for 117 yards and 1 touchdown. I think he's the number 1 tight end this year. He's been fantastic. The last 3 or 4 weeks, he's been consistently up in the upper teens and 20s. So I have nothing more to say, but Austin Hooper's a beast. And George Kittle was the number 3 tight end this week. He had 14.3 fantasy points. He had 8 catches for 103 yards. And the last 2 weeks, George Kittle has finally been doing, what is expected of him. He was drafted in he's usually, I think his ADP was in the 3rd or 4th round this year. And, everybody's been looking for top tight end production out of him, but he's only been doing kind of mediocre until the last couple weeks. So hopefully he keeps getting that volume and he keeps chugging on. Now, unfortunately, 2 of these top 3 tight ends are on Brandon Cook's Kittle corn, so he doesn't need any more help besides Christian McCaffrey in the New England defense. So, I don't know. I don't know how to stop him. He always gets those good players. I don't know what happens. I don't know how he does it. But moving on to the duds of the week at the quarterback position, Jameis Winston. He had 12.1 fantasy points, and he had 400 passing yards. Sounds good, right? He even had a touchdown. But you know what else he had? 5 interceptions. That's the thing about Jameis Winston. He's always been a risky play each week. He has the potential to put up huge numbers. I think in 2 weeks ago or last week he was in the studs category. He's always trying to make big plays, and that comes with big games, but it also comes with these terrible games. So an unfortunate start uh, by the running Mayfields, but that's just what you're gonna get sometimes with Jameis Winston. The other dud of the week was Teddy Bridgewater. He had 13.6 fantasy points. He had 240 passing yards and one touchdown. They still won the game. He was just basically a game manager this week. He didn't really have to do much. He didn't, you know, he's not really fantasy relevant in general from week to week. He just had that one big game last week. Other than that, I think he's been in the low teens. So he's just been managing the game and making sure that they're winning games before Drew Brees gets back. So in the running back category, Joe Mixon was dud number one this week. I guess it was technically dud number two because Derrick Henry had 3.8 fantasy points. He had 28 yards rushing, one catch for 5 yards, and basically Tennessee was game script or Derrick Henry was game scripted out of that game. They lost to 16 to nothing to Denver. Their defense has looked really good. Picked it up the last couple of weeks, and Derrick Henry was kind of game scripted out. So Joe Mixon, as I said before, was a dud this week. He had 4.9 fantasy points. He only had 8 rushes for 10 yards, and he had 2 catches for 29 yards. And he really has a tough time doing anything with their offensive line. He's really having a rough time this year. He's only had 1 or maybe 2 fantasy relevant games. Otherwise, he's been kind of a running back 2 or even a flex option. Which is really unfortunate. Joe Mixon has so much talent, but that offensive line just is not doing any favors for him. The third dud of this week was Melvin Gordon. He had 6.3 fantasy points. He had 8 rushes for 18 yards and 3 catches for 30 yards. The Chargers looked really bad this week. I don't know what happened with them. They didn't really have I think their offensive line is also not that good. And the Steelers' defense has started to pick it up a little bit. So neither running back for the Chargers did well at all this week. So Melvin Gordon, unfortunately, he's not the workhorse that he was before he went out, and I don't know if he's ever going to get back to where he was pre-holdout. I guess the fourth dud in this category was Dion Lewis. He had 3.4 fantasy points. He had -1 rushing yards, but he did have 3 catches for 20 yards. Usually this would be a good game script for him. The Tennessee Titans were down. Unfortunately, he's just not a great fantasy asset, even when Tennessee was behind. He wasn't getting the passes. He wasn't, their offense wasn't moving at all, so he really didn't have any value this week. In the wide receiver category, Keenan Allen had 4.3 fantasy points. He only had 2 catches for 33 yards. I don't know why I traded for him. It's really been rough owning him. Their offense has really looked rough in general, and I think the addition of Hunter Henry took some passes away from Keenan Allen. So hopefully they get it right going forward, and they realize that they need to throw to him more in order to help the offense. Maybe that'll get Phillip Rivers throwing to him a little bit more, but he's been in the dud category the last 3 weeks, so he's got to get a little kick in the ass here. Jarvis Landry was also a dud this week. He had 5.1 fantasy points. He had 3 catches for 36 yards. He is the number 2 in Cleveland, clearly behind OBJ, and Cleveland hasn't had a great offense so far. They've also had a porous offensive line for the passing game. The rushing game has been very, very good, but the passing game is not. And OBJ is struggling to get numbers, so Jarvis Landry is also going to struggle to get numbers. Mohamed Sanu was also a dud. He had 4.4 fantasy points. He had 3 catches for 29 yards. That's the problem with Atlanta, except for Austin Hooper, I guess. There's so many targets to go around, you don't know who's going to do well each week. Even Julio Jones has had a few down weeks just because, there's like 4 or 5 targets you can go to. You can go to Mo Sanu, you can go to Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Austin Hooper, and then Devonta Freeman out of the backfield. That's 5 targets that Matt Ryan can throw to. So not everybody's going to have a good game every week there. So another dud. Unfortunately, this was because he got hurt. Amari Cooper, he only had zero point 0.8 points. But yeah, like I said, he got hurt early in the game, so it's unfortunate that he was started. It was a good matchup. It seemed like it was going to be a good matchup, but um, unfortunately, he didn't really have the opportunity to go nuts. And then Cooper Kupp only had 3.7 fantasy points this week. The Rams' offense just looked terrible. So all the wide receivers suffered, but you're expecting a lot out of Cooper Kupp, especially with the way he's been playing early this season. So that was a disappointment, but he's definitely going to bounce back. Cooper Kupp has been the only person that Jared Goff has really been looking at in the offense. At the tight end position, Evan Engram was for some reason played. I just don't think Ryo saw that he was hurt going in and he wasn't active for the game, so unfortunately got a goose from him. Will Disley, as I mentioned before, had the Achilles injury and he got knocked out pretty early in the game with 0 points. And Gerald Everett was a fill-in for Zerline that never hit you in Darren Waller's bye week. He only had 1.9 points. He had 2 catches for 9 yards, and that just goes along with the Rams offense. They had a rough time this week. All right, on to the matchup reactions from this previous week 6. Matchup number 1, the Scary Terrys defeated Mixon Mac 132.8 points to 112.4 points. Kyler Murray, Chris Carson, and Scary Terry himself led the Scary Terrys to a win over Mixon and his team's namesake. The studs on the Scary Terry's team, Kyler Murray had a big game against a defense full of Swiss cheese in Atlanta. He had 28.8 fantasy points for 340 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. He also had 11 rushes for 32 yards. I love his run floor. I bring it up every week, and I think Kyler Murray was a suitable trade for Lamar Jackson. Chris Carson also had another good game. He had 23.9 fantasy points in the absence of Rashad Penny once again, and I think even when Rashad Penny comes back, he's not going to take very many of these carries. So he had 24 carries for 124 yards and 1 touchdown. He also had 4 catches for 35 yards. He's looked great the last 3 weeks. He's had over 120 total yards in each of the last 3 weeks, and I'm loving his catching usage. Terry McLaurin, as I mentioned before, 24 fantasy points this week. He had a huge week. And James Conner, as I mentioned before, also had a fantastic week. In the duds category, Keenan Allen and Will Disley, what can I do? Will Disley, I can't do anything about. Keenan Allen, I might have to bench you or something, give you a little slap on the ass. So we'll see how it goes this week. Maybe you won't find my starting lineup, Keenan Allen. Team number 2, Mixon Mac. The studs on Mixon Mac. Lamar Jackson, 30.6 fantasy points. He's a great QB every week, as I mentioned. And Chris Godwin had 20.1 points. He had 10 catches for 151 yards. He is the wide receiver 1 on the year. Who'd have thought that going into this season that you'd be looking at Chris Godwin as the number 1 wide receiver on the year and Cooper Kupp as the number 2 wide receiver of the year? Well, Cooper Kupp was last week. I don't know if after that 3.7 point game if he still is, but he's got to be close. So it's a very, very surprising at the top of the wide receiver category. The guys who we thought were going to be very consistent and the elite wide receivers really aren't up there. So it's kind of good. I think it's fun to see people like that at the top. So the duds for Mixon Mac. Joe Mixon of Mixon Mac had 4.9 fantasy points. as I mentioned before, and Marvin Jones Jr. had 2.7 fantasy points. He had 2 catches for 17 yards. Not a big game for anyone in Detroit besides Kenny Galladay and Carrion. Carrion had a decent game, but Galladay had a pretty good game. It's a tough Packers defense, and I'm not going to go over how the ending of that game was. It was not ideal for a fan of the football game, but um, what I do want to say is, and this was put very well from another podcaster, was basically uh, it's not 100% guaranteed that the Packers would have lost because or if those calls hadn't been made, but there was no chance for Detroit to win with those calls that were made. So I agree with that. Um, it's not that they took away. It's not that the refs uh, gave the game to the Packers, although they made it very easy. Um, they just didn't allow Detroit to win. So, the Packers, even though they would have had to punt for that first penalty, uh, knowing the Packers, they could have come back and scored and ended up beating Detroit, but we won't know that, and Detroit never had the chance to win. So it's very unfortunate, but I'm done covering that. On to more fantasy stuff. Unfortunately, more duds than studs this week for Mix and Mac, and the Scary Terrys took that game. Matchup number 2. Try and Stop Me from Auto Picking beats the Running Mayfields 113.6 points to 108.1 points. Team Auto Pick gets good games from Austin Hooper and Curtis Samuel to beat the Mayfields due to duds from Boyd and Winston. So the studs for try and stop me from auto picking. Austin Hooper, clearly 21.7 fantasy points. He's beast mode. He's basically a tight end cheat code this year. He's been crazy. And then Curtis Samuel had 21.8 fantasy points. He had 4 catches for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's been great with Kyle Allen so far. He's been getting some solid volume, and he's been taking the reins from DJ Moore as the wide receiver 1 in that offense. The duds on Team Auto Pick was Marquise Brown. He had a goose, although he did not play. So, once again, the lineups were not quite checked thoroughly, and someone was played who did not play this week. And Jarvis Landry had 5.1 points. And as I mentioned before, the Cleveland Browns have had a rough time in their passing game so far due to their difficult offensive line situation. The running Mayfield studs. Devontae Freeman had a great game. As I mentioned, he was big in the receiving game. He got his 2 touchdowns there. David Johnson on the other side of the ball in that game, he had 25.2 fantasy points. He had a big game for the running. It was a big game for both running backs in that fantasy football game, and you had both of them on your team. And unfortunately, you had Stefon Diggs on the bench with 40 fantasy points that could have won you this game. It's okay. I wouldn't have played Stefon Diggs the way he was playing either, so don't you worry about it. I don't really know what to do with Stefon Diggs going forward. I don't really trust him enough to start him in any week, which really sucks. So the duds this week, Tyler Boyd had 2.5 fantasy points. I forgot him in my actual column of the total duds of the week, but him and the rest of the Bengals had a rough offensive game this week versus Baltimore. Although Baltimore's defense hasn't been fantastic, they are definitely enough to beat the Bengals. So you just kind of had mediocre games from everybody else in your team. Nobody awful. Nobody had a good game either. So it was just kind of a meh week for the running Mayfields. Matchup number 3. Rogers Cup takes down Zerline I Never Hit You to shake off the Miami Dolphins. The classic Miami Dolphins strategy, and he has ascended to the Washington Redskins level. So he beat Zerline I Never Hit You. I did not. 92.8 to 90.9. So it was a close one, and Rogers Cup finally pulled it out from the skin of his teeth. After securing the victory, Rodgers Cup sat Aaron Rodgers to avoid a potential bad game while flexing his victory over the line that never hits you. So the studs from Rodgers Cup, stud number 1, Zeke. He had 23.7 fantasy points. Even though they lost to the Jets, he had a fantastic game. Tyreek Hill on his big game back from injury, 22.5 fantasy points. He brought some life to an okay looking fantasy Kansas City offense. They really haven't looked great the last few weeks, but maybe Tyreek Hill will bring a shock back to their system. And then the Carolina defense and special teams had 18 fantasy points. He had a strong game, or they had a strong game. I mean, it was helped along by 5 interceptions by Jameis Winston, so that really helps the defense. And then Joey Sly had a big game this week. It shouldn't be a surprise. He's been a great kicker all year. But what is cool is that he did get to attempt the rare fair catch free kick from 60 yards. So I don't know if you all know what this is, but basically it's a very rare thing because it happens basically near the end of halves or maybe at the end of a game. So a punter, a team, uh, the Buccaneers in this case, were down on their own, like they're back on their own like 1 yard line, and their punter had to punt from there. So he punted with like 10 seconds left in the half. And it was fair caught at the 50-yard line by the punt returner, and with 1 second left. And so there's this rule in the NFL where you can attempt on a fair catch from a punt, you can attempt a free kick, a free field goal, essentially, from wherever it was fair caught from. So it's basically everybody lines up like it's a kickoff. Like the defense cannot rush. They have to be 10 yards back, and you can have a holder, but the ball can't be on a tee. So it's just like a regular. It's like a kickoff, except you have a holder holding the ball. Or you could attempt a drop kick as well, which is not as frequently used for obvious reasons. It's less accurate, although it tends to go a little bit farther. So he attempted this free kick, and unfortunately he missed. But it was interesting to see the fact that he got to attempt that kick. So that was exciting. Exciting stuff going on. The duds in that category, or on Rogers Cup, was Rex Burkhead. Once again, he didn't play. So 3 of you guys, man, you got to pay attention to your lineups. 3 of you guys played a player that was not playing this week. And then Mohamed Sanu had 4.4 fantasy points. Just wasn't his day in Atlanta. Like I said, all the passes went to Hooper, Jones, and Ridley this week. So now the studs for Zerline never hit you. Russell Wilson had 28.9 fantasy points this week. Going back to doing monster things this year, he's been getting his run on, so that's been great for his floor, and his super efficient passing has been putting a very high cap on his ceiling. So he's been doing great things. And then Julio Jones had 14.8 fantasy points. That wasn't huge, but it was definitely good for his team this week. He's been solid most of the year, so he's been a very consistent fantasy asset this year. The duds on Zerline never hit you. I did not. Was Derrick Henry. He was basically taken out of the game by Denver's defense, as I mentioned. He had 3.8 fantasy points. Gerald Everett had 1.9 fantasy points. That whole Rams offense had a rough time against the 49ers, who look legit now. I was very concerned, or not concerned. I was weary of how good the 49ers defense was because they had only played bad teams. They had played like Miami, Cleveland, like Cincinnati. They played awful teams, but fortunately, they finally played a potentially good team and they shut them down. So the 49ers defense actually looks scary this year. They might be the Bears of this year, to be honest. And the last stud was Melvin Gordon. Basically, he didn't return what you want from Melvin Gordon. You're expecting a workhorse 3 down back, and I don't think he's really going to get back to that. I think the Chargers think they got something good in Austin Eckler, and they don't really want to stop using him. So on to matchup number 4. Brandon Cooks Kittlecorn beats down Big Ben's bathroom by more than doubling his points. 149.3 to 66.3 fantasy points. Brandon Cook's Kittlecorn finally gave Big Ben's bathroom its first loss. Big Ben's bathroom apparently consists of a pile of shit. At least this week. I just had to make the bathroom joke. It was a necessity. The studs for Brandon Cook's Kittlecorn. Matt Ryan had 30.9 fantasy points, and New England's defense and special teams, not surprisingly, they had 28 fantasy points, and their easy schedule is not done yet. They played the Giants this week, but next week, pretty sure they have the Redskins. Also, I'm sorry about that noise in my background. The cat is playing on his little tower over here with toys and whatnot, so he's knocking things around. The duds for Brandon Cooks Kittlecorn was Brandon Cooks. He had 4.7 fantasy points. He was part of that awful offensive game that the Rams had this week. So things will be looking up in the future, I'm sure, for Brandon Cooks. Big Ben's bathroom studs. None. Not any great teams on his team. Not any great games on his team. Lev Bell and Michael Thomas had okay games. They weren't fantastic. They weren't bad. But everyone else was basically a dud. It was a very rough day for Big Ben's bathroom, and surprising off day. I know he hasn't had a huge scoring against him, but he's had some decent weeks, so it was surprising to see him only score 66 fantasy points. The final matchup of the week. My tight end hurts when I fart versus Carry On My Wayward Son. My tight end hurts when I fart took down Carry On My Wayward Son 116.4 to 88.4 points. Nick Chubb leads the charge against Carry On and the Eagles on Wayward Son to take second place by himself in the East Division. My tight end hurts when I fart studs. Tom Brady had 22 fantasy points. He had an easy game versus the Giants this week, and he buffered his numbers with 2 rushing touchdowns. Now, I don't think he had even a passing touchdown, but his 2 rushing touchdowns really did the trick for Tom Brady's fantasy points this week. And Nick Chubb had 26.4 fantasy points. He had a huge game versus Seattle, and he did his best to get the win, but he couldn't quite pull it out. Seattle ended up winning, but Nick Chubb had a great game in the contest. And my tight end hurts when I farts duds. Dion Lewis had 3.4 fantasy points. Like I said, Tennessee got stuffed by Denver. Even the passing running back could not do well. So now, Team 2, Carry On My... Ooh, that was bad. Ooh, I apologize. Carry On My Wayward Son. Studs. Alshon Jeffrey had 18.6 fantasy points. He had a lot of receptions without Deshaun Jackson there, so he's been a target hog, and he's been a great half-point PPR fantasy asset this year when he's been healthy. And the other Eagle, Carson Wentz, had 20.5 fantasy points. He had a great game versus Minnesota, which is surprising because they have a great defense, but he couldn't quite outscore the Vikings' passing offense, which is a surprise because the Vikings' passing offense did not show their face until this week. The duds for Carry On. Evan Ingram didn't play on Thursday, as I mentioned, and Cooper Kupp, part of that Rams offense. So, kind of a rough week. Besides Alshon and Carson Wentz, didn't have too many great games from Carry On. So, now, the waiver wire team that would definitely kick all of our asses by so many points that it's not even funny. The quarterback was Kirk Cousins with 27.3 fantasy points. Running back 1, Jamal Williams with 21.6 fantasy points. Running back 2 was Chase Edmonds with 13.7 fantasy points. Wide receiver 1 was Jaron Brown. The Seattle Seahawks had 16.4 fantasy points in Will Disley's absence. Wide receiver 2 was Jamison Crowder with 12.8 fantasy points. The tight end was Ricky Seals-Jones with 12.2 fantasy points. And the flex was Duke Johnson with 12.4 fantasy points. The defense and special teams was the Broncos with 20 fantasy points. And the kicker was Brett Mayer of Brandon McManus. Both of them had 13 points. They would have totaled 149.4 points. Would have killed all of us, even Courts. It would have beat Courts by 0.1 fantasy points. So, still technically a win. And technically correct is the best kind of correct. So, it still would have kicked all of our asses. All right, on for my matchup predictions for next week. For the previous week, I was 2 for 5. Much better than last week, I suppose. Hopefully, that will only continue to go up. And that's going to start off with matchup number 1, the Scary Terrys versus Zerline that never hits you. I did not. The projected winner is the Scary Terrys. Kyler Murray and the rest of the gang have great matchups and will lead the Scary Terrys to victory over Zerline. Zerline's running backs have some tough matchups this week. Matchup number 2, Try and Stop Me from Auto-Picking versus Mix and Mac. The projected winner, Try and Stop Me from Auto-Picking. Mix and Mac won't be able to overcome a bye from Chris Godwin and will lose to the partially auto-picked team. Matchup number 3, Rogers Cup versus Brandon Cooks Kittlecorn. The projected winner, Rogers Cup. In a surprising upset, the return of Saquon Barkley and Zeke and Tyreek Hill will lead Rogers Cup to take advantage of the Christian McCaffrey bye week and beat Brandon Cooks Kittlecorn while he's vulnerable. Matchup number 4, Big Ben's Bathroom versus My Tight End Hurts When I Fart. The projected winner, My Tight End... No, I lied. The projected winner is Big Ben's Bathroom. The buys are hitting hard this week, and Nick Chubb's bye forces My Tight End Hurts When I Fart to lose shorthandedly to Big Ben's Bathroom. Matchup number 5, Carry On My Wayward Son versus the Running Mayfields. Projected winner, Carry On My Wayward Son. Carry On My Wayward Son will take the win over the quarterbackless Running Mayfields to get him over 500. All right, guys, now it's time for the question Q&A section. This time, I have 2 questions. So, I was able to fit in an extra one out of all of the questions I got. So, hopefully I got to your question. If not, try again later. The first question is a repeat question asker. It's Adam from Rockford. Once again. Hi, Jason. Big fan. I was wondering, where did you find your intro and outro music? Thanks, Adam. Well, Adam, it's literally from a website called freesound.org. They have a lot of user-made content there that's pretty cool that people just put out there for anyone to use. So, yeah, that's where I got it from. And hopefully, in the future, I'm going to add more sounds from there. I'm going to try to add some, funny sound effects and maybe some drops for the different segments and whatnot. I haven't gotten there yet, but that's hopefully where I'm going. Now, question number 2 from Benaya, who from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Bonjour, all the way out in Pittsburgh. Benaya writes, who do you think you are? Well, Benaya, besides when I'm running around stealing hearts, I think I am the commissioner of the Gooshbagz Fantasy Football League, the winner of a matchup versus Zerline that never hit you in Week 7, and your future 29 Gooshbagz League champion. So there. Alright, you chodes, that's all I got for you this week. Good luck to you and your matchups this week. Goodbye.